those of us who are, and in many cases have been for a very, very long time, been exposing and challenging the official version of global events. And for a long time, well, look at my case. For a long time, we were just dismissed as nutters, crazies. In my case, completely insane, and almost historic levels of abuse and ridicule. But with the passage of world events, contrasted or compared with what people like me have been saying over the years is the plan to unfold, have brought extraordinary numbers of people compared with the past to look at the information. And what they're saying in these increasingly large numbers is, well, this actually makes sense of world events far more than what the authorities are telling us. And this has reached a point where those very authorities, the form of politicians and mainstream media and all these different aspects, have to start to see the challenge from the alternative media and decide what they're going to do about it. And those decisions have been made clear in very recent times with the speech at the United Nations by the British Prime Minister David Cameron, in which he equated ISIS with non-violent conspiracy theorists, basically. On the face of it, the remark was idiocy, kind of idiocy with which people like Cameron have become obviously very well associated. But it wasn't that kind of idiocy, because there was a method in it, and that is to start to equate in the public mind people challenging the official lies, mendacity of government with supporting terrorism or creating the information environment in which people would turn to terrorism. And you can expect a lot more of this. These are just some of the opening shots. I'll get to what Cameron said as we go along. And you can also expect more and more efforts to undermine, discredit, and altogether turn people against people like me and others, some of whom have been putting this out for decades now. And I guess the best example before Cameron's speech, this in these very recent days, was what was said in a paper by one of what they call Obama's czars. This was a bloke a few years ago now called Cass Sunstein, and here's a report of what he'd like to do in relation to the subject we're talking about. Headline: Top Obama czar infiltrate all conspiracy theorists. Presidential advisor wrote about crackdown on expressing opinions. And it was what's described here as a lengthy academic paper. And Sunstein, the regulatory czar, does that mean he's regular? I don't know, maybe. And he argued that the US government should ban conspiracy theorizing. So you are deeply in to the world of 1984 and the whole Orwellian state of speech crime and thought crime. So he argued, and this is what this whole Cameron speech is about, and also the measures announced by the Home Secretary Theresa May at the Tory Party conference this week. This is what they are leading to and seeking to introduce. So let's just go through a few of these things. Among the beliefs that Sunstein would ban is advocating that the theory of global warming is a deliberate fraud. Well, it clearly is. And the evidence is overwhelming that it is. And it's a creation to justify the transformation of deindustrialization of global society. And to bring in something called Agenda 21. Google that if you're not aware of it. It'll blow your mind. Sunstein also recommended the government send agents to infiltrate, quote, extremists who supply conspiracy theories. See, this is the way the perception deception works. You hijack the definition of words and terms. So the government, even though it's terrorizing, bombing, slaughtering millions and millions of people in engineered wars and engineered famines and all this other stuff, engineered terrorism. Despite all that, the government's is the reference point for morality and the reference point for moderation. No matter how extreme they are, they're the reference point of moderation. And so you have this garbage that's trotted out by these people like Cameron and Obama, where they talk about American values. We're safeguarding American values. We are coming from a point of British values. Well, both America and Britain have been bombing the shit out of people throughout modern history. And it doesn't matter because they're the reference point. So the idea is that because they are that reference point of morality and balance and peace and justice, that anyone that challenges them, exposes them for the liars, frauds and psychopaths that they are, is an extremist. Well, Big Brother moves on again this week, or more like Big Sister in Britain, in the form of Home Secretary Theresa May, who has announced more anti-terrorism measures. And you'll remember in the wake of 9/11 in North America, Britain and other countries, a great swathe of anti-terrorism legislation came in which the definition of what was meant by terrorism, terrorists, terrorist activity, was so ill-defined and so lacking detail in the definition of what the law was targeting, that those laws could be used across the society in general. And they were, and they have been. We have had some extraordinary examples of the way in Britain that anti-terrorism legislation has been used to keep surveillance on people and be used against people who are absolutely nothing to do with terrorism. I'll give you an example. One local council used anti-terrorism legislation to keep surveillance on a couple to make sure that they did live in the catchment area of the school that applied for their child to attend. And this is what has been going on. And so when something comes out and someone makes a speech like Theresa May this week and says, you know, these are new laws against terrorism and terrorist activity, or this new word now, laws against extremism, define extremism. Exactly. And so the laws that they are bringing in, the new ones announced this week, are designed in just the same way to be applied to the population in general, and very much to people like me and others who are exposing the scams and the conspiracies involving governments and all the rest of the networks of deceit. And I'll get into that as we go along. And, you know, when you look at this whole kind of subject area, what's happening in Ferguson, Missouri with the protests, which of course have gone nationwide in the United States and even manifested in London too. And so it's vital that we see how the dots connect, to see how the scam is unfolding, to take away more and more and more of our basic freedoms for free expression, free speech, free perception, and free opinion. All these are being targeted by anti-terrorism legislation. And this is a newspaper report on Theresa May's stuff this week. Universities will have to ban hate preachers from speaking on campus under a crackdown unveiled yesterday by Theresa May. Once again, we're looking for definitions. What defines a hate preacher? Some of it can be obvious. They're preaching hatred against people and preaching violence against people and war against people. Yeah, you can see that. But unless it's absolutely defined, you can then start to widen that. So governments say, well, this person exposing this politician or exposing this scam and conspiracy within government is preaching hatred against government, hatred against government ministers. And it could very easily be widened to do that, and is. I mean, the examples are there endlessly from previous legislation claiming to be against terrorism. Schools, colleges, prisons and councils will also be ordered to put in place anti-extremism policies. Okay, define extremism. Again, well, you can define it in a small area, although they don't, but then you can widen it. Well, is someone who says 9/11 was an inside job, are they extremists? Well, that's the idea, to move this and use this legislation to bring about a situation where that is precisely the case. So conspiracies and exposing conspiracies, having an opinion about conspiracies, will eventually be considered extremism and thus banned. This is where it's leading, and this is why we need to keep our eyes right on the ball with all this, because it's very clear, and there are past precedents, like I say, that show that this is just the foot in the door. It's not where it's meant to stay. Well, the term conspiracy theorist is being heard more and more these days, and there's a very good reason for that, because more and more the conspiracies, actually, in my view, overwhelmingly different expressions of the same conspiracy, have been brought to light and made more blatantly obvious over the last few years, and with some people over the last few decades. And there is a need, therefore, to discredit that information and those suggestions of conspiracy, to stop the public seeing that what is being said is true. And the term conspiracy theorists or conspiracy theory was first widely employed by the CIA to try to discredit people pointing out the bloody obvious about the Kennedy assassination, that it was not what the official story claimed it was. And in fact, the official story was so ludicrous that it demanded unthinking, unquestioning, slavish innocence from the public. in the ludicrous belief that authority would never lie to you, particularly over the death of a president. All that was necessary for the official story to be believed and to stand up. And so, in the face of trying to sell such a ridiculous theory, the idea was to just target those that were saying the obvious, that the official story was ridiculous. And so the term conspiracy theorist started to be widely used. And of course, since the Kennedy assassination, and particularly in more recent times, starting around the early 1990s and more to present day, evidence has been uncovered of endless hidden in the shadows conspiracies and manipulations to direct the world in particular ways. And so the old favourite, the old standby conspiracy theorists has been used as a weapon of propaganda to try to elicit by reflex action a dismissal of any evidence once the purveyor of that evidence is dubbed a conspiracy theorist. And this has gone on in the face of the most obvious evidence of conspiracies of many various kinds, which overwhelmingly, as I say, I would say are different expressions of the same one conspiracy. And so it was such a pleasure and so nice to read an article in the Telegraph newspaper in Britain, or at least on their website, that's where I saw it, by a guy called Alex Proud. And it's a very balanced article, and hands up to him for that. And it's headed, "Perhaps the world's conspiracy theorists have been right all along." Hallelujah. Have they been right about everything? Of course not. Have they been right about most of it, and certainly the theme of what's going on? Absolutely. And it says, "We used to laugh at conspiracy theorists, but from FIFA to banking scandals and the Iraq war, it seems they might have been onto something after all." He says you'd have your mate who, after a few beers, would tell you that the moon landings were faked, or that the Illuminati controlled everything, or that the US government was holding alien autopsies in Area 51. And you'd be able to dismiss this because it was all rubbish, he says. He goes on, "It's true that there was always the big one, which wasn't quite so easily dismissed. This was the Kennedy assassination. But here you could be fairly sure that the whole thing was a terrible, impenetrable, murky morass. You knew that some things never would be known or would be released, partially redacted by the CIA 200 years in the future. And you knew that whatever the truth was, it was probably a bit dull compared with your mate's flights of fancy involving the KGB, the Mafia, and the military-industrial complex. Besides, it all made for a lot of very entertaining films and books. But," he says in the article, "this nice, cozy state of affairs lasted until the early 2000s. But then something changed. These days, conspiracy theories don't look so crazy, and conspiracy theorists don't look like crackpots. In fact, today's conspiracy theory is tomorrow's news headlines. If you read my books, for instance, from the last few years, in fact, the last nearly 25, you'll see that they did make tomorrow's headlines in terms of what happened subsequently in relation to what was said was planned in the books. And that's not because of genius or prophecy. It's because when you uncover what the plan is and what is planned to unfold, unless something comes along to intervene in that, then it will unfold. And in effect, you're predicting the future, but not from the ether, from knowing what the plan is to transform planet Earth into a Alcatraz for humans. It's tempting, he says, I suppose, to say we live in a golden age of conspiracy theories, although it's only really golden for the architects of the conspiracies. From the Iraq war to FIFA to the banking crisis, the truth is not only out there, but it's more outlandish than anything we could have made up. That's a great line, because one of the greatest defense mechanisms to the uncovering or the acceptance in people's minds of these conspiracies or that conspiracy is the chasm that has to be crossed between the world as people have been programmed from birth to perceive it and is constantly underpinned by the mainstream media, etc., and what's really going on. And so there is a great effort by people who know what they're doing, and lots of people who just don't know what they're doing but have bought the lie, to discredit those people who are uncovering and communicating what the mainstream media won't. So let's just look at the definition of a conspiracy, the dictionary definition. An agreement to perform together an illegal, wrongful, or subversive act. Now, on that definition alone, this world is drowning in conspiracies. Another definition, an agreement between two or more persons to commit a crime or accomplish a legal purpose through illegal action. Once again, we're swimming. A joining or acting together as if by sinister design. A secret plan or agreement to carry out an illegal or harmful act, especially with political motivation, plot. Weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and the act of making such plans secret. So that is the definition or definitions of conspiracy. And you can see that it's not just that there are conspiracies by those definitions, but we are deluged with them at all levels of society. And you still get people saying, do you believe in the conspiracy theory of history, or do you believe in the cock-up theory? As if they're mutually exclusive, as if you have to pick one or the other. And of course, it's a mixture of both. Of course, people make cock-ups, bad decisions, and then things unfold. Of course that happens. But when you do the research, most people don't, you find that an enormous amount of what happens in the world is coldly calculated in the shadows to play out in the public arena as either random or unconnected